podcast role. Welcome in.
Before we jump in, a quick note. Today is an Encore presentation. We are revisiting one of our favorite conversations from the archive because, well, honestly, it's one that's really stuck with us, and we think it'll stick with you too. Our guest is Dr. Stephen Pruitt, and at the time of this conversation, he was president of the Southern Regional Education Board. Since then, he's moved on to a new role as president of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges. So keep that in mind as you listen. You'll hear him talk about SREB throughout, but the wisdom here travels with him wherever he goes. And I have to warn you up front, this man is a walking quote machine. He's got what he calls Pruittisms, these little maxims he lives by, and they hit different every time. And my favorite is, education is basically harder than rocket science. He should know. The guy started out as a high school chemistry teacher who says he got into the field, and I quote, because he could legally blow things up. But it's not all one-liners, and this episode goes to some real depth. Stephen walks us through how he helped guide the next generation science standards by getting nearly 50 states to buy into a massive collaborative rewrite on how we teach science. And he did this by using a framework that he calls the difference between a stakeholder and a shareholder. One's just someone who's standing near the hammer, hoping that they don't get hit, and the other is actually owning the outcome. It's a distinction that'll change how you think about buy-in on your next big initiative. And then the conversation goes somewhere even heavier and really even more important, I think, from a leadership standpoint. Stephen was Kentucky's Commissioner of Education during the Marshall County High School shooting in 2018. And when he shares about walking into that recovery, quietly, in jeans and a polo, just there to carry backpacks and get people lunch. Really, to me, it was one of the most honest reflections on crisis leadership that we've ever recorded. He talks about the phase that everyone forgets, not prevention, not the moment of crisis itself, but recovery. What happens after the cameras leave? Our conversation is really, it's about systems, it's about humility, and it's about what it actually means to lead like a servant. So stick around to the end for a closing line about Hallmark movies versus Lifetime movies. You'll know it when you hear it. But before we do that, we do have a word from our sponsor, IXL. One thing that comes up again and again in our conversation is the idea that real lasting change in education happens when you meet people exactly where they are, not with a one-size-fits-all mandate, but really with something that's built around the individual. And that's exactly how IXL approaches things. It uses a real-time diagnostic to pinpoint exactly what each student knows and what they need next. So please, if you're interested in IXL, look them up. IXL.com/imperfect. Okay, now our conversation with Stephen Pruitt. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I mean, of course, you're going to hear Jamie and me talk first. Alrighty, take care.
I'm really excited about our guest today, Stephen Pruitt. He talks about heroes at one point, and I was just reading about Representative Barbara Lee and that she's retiring, and I don't think I realized that. There was an article in the Seattle Times about her and her hero, who was Shirley Chisholm.
So not a bad choice.
No,
in terms
exactly.
of heroes.
Yeah.
Who's your hero?
Who's my hero? I'd say, I guess, if I have a hero, I never thought of her as that, but you see that up there on the wall? That's Anne Frank. She's the first thing that goes up in my office wherever I am. The place where I do work and the last thing that comes down when I leave a job. And I got this at, it was her home. It's now a museum. And I just love the quote, which is, in the meantime, I must uphold my ideals, for perhaps there'll be a time when I can carry them out. And so it's always a reminder to me, stay true to your values and who you are and what you believe. And sometime, at some point, you'll be able to carry them out.
That's good. Can I share mine?
I'm so sorry that I didn't ask. Yes, please.
You don't have to ask. I'm going to force myself to share. Because he mentions the concept of a hero that helps guide us, that helps or inspire us to the kind of person that we want to be. And mine is my grandfather. I mean, I could easily say my grandmother as well, or my mother, but I'm going to choose my grandfather for this particular conversation, in that and I've said this before, he used to say that, he was a Stanford grad at a time that there just weren't Mexicans going to Stanford University. That just wasn't something that happened. But his saying and his stance around humility were so profound to me that I still live by that edict today. And that is that you should never have to tell someone you're smart. Ever. Avoid the people that wear their PhDs on their chest, this is why I got along with Stephen Pruitt just great. He uses the word servant, to be a servant to the community. That really is inspiring to me. That's what I am trying to be and do, to the point where I'm like, I think of other jobs that I might be able to do well if I had done a different path. And I'm like, I think I would have made a pretty good cop. If you could let me be a servant to the community, if that's truly what I get to be, could have been a pretty good priest. And that over and over and over is sort of a driver. And it's connected to how my grandfather lived and how my grandmother lived. And those are the people that inspire me.
Let's talk about Stephen Pruitt, because I just adored him. And in the same way that you have just mentioned, the way he approached things as a servant leader, I loved a number of things. One, that he was so comfortable convening groups like the Unintended Consequences Committee.
Wasn't that great?
Yes.
I love it.
And so I will say to the audience, because I don't want to talk too much about that yet, I want you to listen for that, because we talk about systems thinking quite a bit in this conversation, and having an Unintended Consequences Committee was so cool. So I'll just stop there. But I do want to talk about something ahead of the conversation.
Yeah.
And that is a warning to those who are listening, because he talks about a school shooting, something that is incredibly powerful and problematic for us as a nation. And he talks about our ability to work on prevention and then management in any kind of crisis. And certainly in this case, it was a school shooting. And he'll talk about the importance of recovery as well, the recovery phase, and how that's overlooked. So I'm really excited to talk about that as well. So
I fully agree. That reflection was profound.
do you have any, he had Pruittism, so I want the audience to listen for that too. Do you have any that people assign to you that says, it's so Jamie?
I don't know. You just talked to Melissa Sonic and she said, oh, I've got this Post-it. I don't even know what the Post-it says. What does the Post-it say that she has on next to her computer?
So for the audience, you'll hear Melissa talk about that in a week or so. It is true. She has a Post-it that is a reminder to her of what you do say, or a prompt that you have given to her. So I won't share what that is yet, because I think that's stealing her words. I will tell you, though, I have one, because you asked me at one point, write this down, or you said something along the lines of, because I have it. It's a purple Post-it that says, why didn't you? So to ask someone like, why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you do that?
I wish it wasn't why didn't you? Because it feels so accusatory.
Well, but you don't say it as, it's almost, okay. So for example, when
So
you,
how come?
let me see if I have it right in front of me. I do. So restorative practice has the cards, right?
Oh, yeah.
And here are cards you're supposed to ask to keep the conversation focused and non-judgmental. And if you do it regularly, then you don't need the card as much, because it just flows. When you're first starting off, the cards are helpful. So the second bullet says, what were you thinking at the time? And if you're just reading it without understanding the situation or the context, you might sound like a parent who says, what were you thinking? So I don't interpret it, why didn't you, as accusatory. I see it as a prompt to remind me to dig a little bit more and allow someone to tell their story, and then to come back and ask maybe a follow-up that just tries to take off a thin layer to get a little bit deeper. And so it's there as a reminder to me.
I think the concept of using questions to better understand people, to really listen to people and what they care about is, I don't know if that's a Jamieism or a Mansanism, but it definitely is key to my approach and the measure of when I'm not doing it well versus well.
For me, I wouldn't say it's a saying as much as a maxim or just a reminder that any change, real change, is gradual and it happens step by step. And I'm constantly saying it to others as well.
Yeah.
Is to just remind, like, hey, we didn't get here yesterday. Like it didn't just happen. Like you're trying to dig us out of a system that was established well before we were even born. And so real change, enduring change happens step by step.
I did that. He talks about that. He talks about that when Stephen Pruitt talks about the Chick-fil-A, my pleasure, and how that took 3 years and that's just saying the phrase. It's it. I had a bunch of Pruittisms that I loved. I don't know if I want to share them here. Should I share them at the end?
Well, let's do this. Let's listen to the conversation. We'll come back and then we'll have a conversation about.
Maybe we'll ask the listeners, like, what was your favorite Pruittism? Because there were a bunch of
really good ones. Yeah, there are some really good ones. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Today on An Imperfect Leader, our guest is Dr. Stephen Pruitt, the president of the Southern Regional Education Board. Stephen, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, it is such an honor to meet you. And if it's okay, I'm going to jump right in, and please accept my apologies with this really long intro. And I promise you it's on my way to a question. But on your homepage, you list your wide-ranging experiences. You've been Kentucky State Commissioner of Education. You have served as the Associate State Superintendent and Chief of Staff for the Georgia Department of Education. Your site highlights how you have served as a board member to the Council of Chief State School Officers. You've been the president of the Council of State Science Supervisors. Incidentally, what caught my eye is how you helped develop the framework for K-12 science education, also known as the Next Generation Science Standards. And all of those are super impressive for sure. What I loved about your bio, and sure, it likely makes a lot of sense because it's chronologically placed, but what I loved about your bio is that you lead with the fact that you were and you are a teacher. You taught high school chemistry, and I think that matters. Educational leaders must serve really as lead learners, and that's what teachers are. They are the activators of knowledge. And so, am I right? You come from a long line of teachers in your family?
I am, and I will tell you that's not by accident or even chronological. I have always said the most important job I ever had was that of a teacher. It is, and I joke that I went into chemistry because I could legally blow things up. And it's the same reason I went into policy. I could blow things up in policy too. I come from a long line of teachers. I'm a third generation educator. My son is a fourth generation educator. And as much opportunity as I've been blessed with, it was those years in my classroom that have formed me for who I am.
I love it. Bren Elliott was a guest in, I think, my first season of the podcast, and she was in Washington, D.C. I think she has since left. She was in the Army, and she said that she also became a science teacher because she could blow things up.
Well, it's kind of
an interesting trend.
A common thing. My principal wasn't always happy with me, but most of the time it was all good. Oh, yes, they were.
Yeah, I bet. I'm hoping we can talk about how one goes about such a monumental system change. School superintendents, that we are all tasked with making these system-wide changes. And you were part of the system-wide change really at the national level. If it's okay, can I return to the time that you worked on the National Science Standards? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process that you used and maybe how you applied. And I read how you described this in another scenario, the difference between building stakeholders and shareholders. And I thought that could be interesting. So would you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And actually, that statement you just made about shareholders versus stakeholders is actually a foundational philosophy for me. And so what that means is, and this is actually how we approach the process for developing NGSS, was in education, we love words, right? And we love to make words up that often mean the same things. One of the words that we love is stakeholder. Look at where stakeholders come from. It comes from around the time of P.T. Barnum, people holding large stakes while someone else swings a very large hammer near your head while you're holding it at a distance, right? And sometimes people feel that way in education where I hope I don't get hit while I'm trying to support this. And so it should be a little bit of a scary ordeal. A shareholder is somebody that's invested. In the finance world, of course, it's with money. But where I talk about shareholders is we want to build a common vision and a common goal that everybody can invest of themselves and everybody can own. And so you become a shareholder in a bigger system idea, a bigger system change, and you don't have some of the issues that are, I hope I don't get hammered with this. I'd rather you stand up and say, I'm going to support this. So when we were doing the NGSS, the way it all started was the National Academies of Science did the framework for K-12 science education. And I was a member of that committee. And it had really cool people on there. It was that we had some Nobel Prize winners. We had people at the top of their field in science. And they let me tag along. Well, then I got hired at Achieve to run the process for developing the standards, which is, as you well know, when you talk about standards in education, I always look at it as it's the contract between the State Department of Ed and teachers as to what your students are going to be held accountable for. I had done that in Georgia, still have some scars and maybe some support group that I have to go to periodically for having lived through that. And so we try to set this up where how do we build the most buy-in in a process that is massive when you're talking about trying to get a country on board? So we kind of went into it with a couple of things. One is the foundational principle we already talked about. Another was transparency. So how can we put things out for people to react to? And then how can we prove that we listen to them?
That's what I was going to ask you. You have you're obligated to have these listening sessions or public comment sessions. And how do you know that when you're actually making a comment that someone is actually attending to it?
Yeah, exactly. So for instance, we set it up where there were going to be, we had 26 states that had signed on as lead states. So I was marshaling 26 states, 40 writers, but I also didn't want to leave out the rest of the states. The 26 were the ones that were kind of working hardest on it, and they would get drafts and then they would give us feedback and we replied to all the drafts. So you made these comments, here's what we did. We also did 3 public reviews of K-12. And the idea was, look, put it out there. Tell us what you don't like. We're going to put it back out there a second time so that people can say, we told you this and you either did it or you didn't. But we also included the same thing we did for the lead states of here were the comments. Here's how we reacted. If we didn't react, here's why. So to me, one of the coolest part of that whole process was when the standards were released in Texas. I'm in a room there. I was told there was over 2,000 people that were in the room. It was at the National Science Teacher Association meeting. So I said, if you were a writer on the NGSS, stand. If you were a lead state, please stand. If you were on a committee. So what we did was we had a writing committee. Well, each lead state had to have the same committee structure. So you ended up with these multipliers, right? And so I'd said, so if you were on a review team, stand up. If you review this as part of a national organization, stand up. By the time I got through everybody, way over 90% of the room is standing. And even now I get chills about it. Yes, we actually got
it signals to you this was an inclusive process that evolved.
Exactly.
Right. You were able to harvest the wisdom of so many people.
Exactly. And we had teachers, we had administrators, we had professional organizations, we had business and industry, so we had all of those different assets that were at the table. And so when it came down to time for people to adopt, we didn't care if they called them next generation science standards. We didn't care if they took them and adapted them. We didn't, we were like, just this is the philosophy for how to go. And as a result, 49 states have adopted them or something like them, and they have not been repealed yet. And that's always a good thing. And
that's interesting though, because you're talking science, which can be controversial. Right. And you're so right. Even in Missouri, I was wondering at what point were they going to pull them and change them similar to what they were doing with language arts standards and things like that. And truly, I think the vast majority, 98% of what came from the work that was done at the national level was adopted. And I can't even remember what was excluded. And so it really speaks to the inclusive process. So as I take that national model and think about how a superintendent might lead their own work within their own district, let's say, you know, they're adopting some curriculum or things like that. It's how do they bring these, I'll use your term, shareholders together in a way that allows them at some point to say, if you've been a part of the conversation, if you've been a member of the writing team, if you've been on a committee, would you please stand and be able to notice that this shouldn't be an issue for our community because it included the entire community.
So there are kind of two. So one thing you'll learn about me if you spend any time with me is I kind of have what some people refer to as Pruittisms. Okay. And they're just kind of things that they're kind of rules that I live by. I think it's why some people refer to me as the Andy Griffith of ed policy. But one is education is not rocket science because rocket science is actually easier.
I say that a lot.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate to think that. And the other one is no great education idea ever died in the vision phase. The difference between a stakeholder and a shareholder is you have to build a shareholder. You identify or name a stakeholder. So if I'm thinking about this from a superintendent's perspective, and I sort of did this a little bit, even when I was commissioner of ed in Kentucky, you know, the Every Student Succeeds Act got passed. And I wanted to really maximize what the law allowed me to do with accountability. So we created these massive groups of teachers, superintendents, principals, counselors. I had one group that was called the Unintended Consequences Committee. And they were the ones that usually... And these were the guys that usually complained about everything. So I put them on a committee and said, look, I want to hear what you're saying. And so I think as a superintendent, if you want to do this kind of work and really see change, you got to first know that it takes a long time. Chick-fil-A says, my pleasure, right? According to things I've read, it took 3 years to get that into the culture of Chick-fil-A. Okay. It's not like they sent out a memo. So to do that, though, you got to build those shareholders. You build your teams with critical people that can be your voices. When we did the accountability in Kentucky, I had a group of superintendents who had always been at the top end, and this model was going to significantly change their outcome. I knew I needed them on board. So when it came down to it, it wasn't me that proposed this to the State Board of Ed. Those 5 superintendents were the ones that actually went to the podium. And it was because they had that role. So I think when a superintendent's doing that at the local level, it's really sitting down thinking, what are my assets? Who are my priorities? Who needs to, and then what's my message and who needs to hear that message? And then you go into a process that's not going to be easy.
Nor should it be fast. Right.
And
that's the issue for so many. They are hired to be change agents and they misinterpret that, or they are sent a message, do this quickly. And that typically is why they then exit fairly quickly also.
Absolutely. And I think that, first of all, you usually can't have something easy and fast. And so those things usually fail. And that's where the idea might have been great, but implementation was terrible. So I think that when people are thinking about this as the leader, part of what you do is say, okay, so this is where I want to go. What are some things that I can, with evidence, show that I am making change, but this is the goal of where I want to get to? And frankly, sometimes you can't let everybody in on what that goal looks like because there will be resistance to that goal. So you have to actually kind of plan this out to say, I'm going to do this in these phases. And I'm going to talk about it like this up to this point, but then I'm going to change and talk about it's still the same thing, but I might expand that vision as I go.
If you're just joining us, my guest is Dr. Stephen Pruitt, the president of the Southern Regional Education Board. And Stephen, in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's this dimension in the model called the leader's learning work. And really, it's the mind of the work. And systems thinking and system design is embedded in that domain. You made a comment about unintended consequences, and I love the fact that you brought in potentially the individual who had most issue with change, potentially. They liked status quo, maybe. That you asked them to consider the short-term, long-term, and unintended consequences of any action. I use this card from the Water Center for Systems Thinking quite a bit with individuals, so I was so glad to hear you say that. But I'm really excited, truly, about your organization's new journal, the Southern Regional Education Board, or the SREB Journal of Education Practices and Trends. And would you take a minute to describe how the journal is different, I guess, from other education resources that are available to leaders in the field?
Sure. We're very excited about it. There have been other journals that are similar. The New England Journal of Education was around for a long time. It's actually ended. And this came about actually in a conversation with Jim Purcell, who is the state higher ed executive director in Alabama. I think what's different about this is it tries to bring some focus to different messaging around key issues in education, especially in post-secondary. And so it's not like in some of the traditional journals where, oh, I research in this, so I'm going to put that in here, but it may not have anything to do with the article that's on the next page. What we want to do, and we have a really hardcore belief at SREB that we have to think about the world as a system. From education to workforce. You will never hear me talk about just K-12 or just post-secondary. You're going to hear me talk about the education to workforce system because I'm a chemist. Systems are at equilibrium. You can make little changes in a system, but its goal is to reach equilibrium. So to really make change in a system, you actually have to make change to all parts of a system. So with this journal, what we really wanted to do was take things like longitudinal literacy, which is the idea of learning across the whole spectrum. You know, it used to be, well, not used to be, still people say you learn to read by third grade and then you read to learn. Well, no, I had to learn to read the Chang chemistry book, and when I was in college, I had to learn to read organic chemistry books. I'd say a person never stops learning to read. So that goes all the way through career pathways, the idea of AI and where AI is taking us as a field and as an industry and as a nation. We can't think about just the pieces that are going along with that. So the journal is meant to say, let's have a focus on researched ideas that are impacting education in the South and subsequently the country.
So if I understand correctly, you'll have each issue has sort of a theme, and then it's looking and threading from whether it's K-12 or it is K-12 all the way through as a way to sort of bridge everyone together.
That's right.
Is there a promising practice that you would love to talk about that maybe highlighted in a recent issue?
What we're really excited about are the journal is giving the ability for people to do some of this work that may not get into a traditional peer review. SREB is what's called an interstate compact. We are created by state legislatures, and we exist in the state law of all 16 of our states. So this journal, part of what it's doing is it's providing additional information and research to legislators, governors, state school superintendents, and it's creating this new perspective itself of how do we think about how AI is impacting different things.
To me,
right?
it seems, so you're probably familiar with Kim Marshall and the Marshall Memo, and he reads every piece of resource out there and then each week decides what are the most important articles for people to read, and then sort of creates this repository where you can search it by theme. And that's one individual where I think to myself, where is that, what happens after Kim decides that he's not going to do that anymore? To have this where policymakers came together and said, this is so important that it ought to be a part of each of our 16 states as part of legislation, as part of this will maintain and sustain itself so that when you decide that this is not something that you're going to continue doing, that the next person who comes in as part of your own succession planning continues this work and is able to inform better practices around education. I think it's really marvelous. What a legacy. Yeah. How can people find it if they want to access the journal?
They can go to sreb.org. And the simple thing to do at that point would be to go up to the search bar and just type in journal.
Sounds like that might need to change. Don't make it a hidden gem. It's like when I'm in New York and I go to the airport and they only have Yankee hats, and I put out on LinkedIn, because the only social media I'm on, saying, "Hey, Steve Cohen, I love the Mets. Let's not keep them a secret." Start selling some hats here.
No, you're right. We will be putting a link to that on our homepage because we do want more people to look at it. We are actually working on
our. It seems like really important work.
It really is. I mean, and it's really fascinating because again, one difference is whereas a lot of journals go monthly, we're having to do it more quarterly because it takes a lot of work.
Sure. If you're
Not
going to
just
vet,
to write the article and not just to vet, but actually, how do you put these things together in a way that makes sense? And even then, if you just skim the titles, it's okay. Well, how do those things fit? You actually kind of have to dig into them a little bit because, I mean, we've got one on literacy practice and there's one on FAFSA. And so you're like, how does those have anything to do with these? Well, literacy, like I was talking about, is through adulthood.
right.
Well, FAFSA, part of the reason why we don't see a lot of FAFSA people, there's a literacy component of that.
That's right.
And so, yeah, it takes a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle to put all of that together.
I love it. Well, one of the things, the reason why I would say this is, so I went to EIE, hosted in Oklahoma City, and there were a number of southern states that were really talking about some of the really innovative and inspiring work that they're doing. And often it is overlooked by others around the country. And so the fact that you're putting this together and creating it, I think could be really transformative in terms of just one's own bias around where are promising practices taking place. So that's just
right.
So
right.
I don't need to
And I
tell you
love
something
that
you
you
already
use the
know
term-
since you've been doing this work for a long time. But
True, but I do give you kudos for using the term promising practice. Again, education in our words, right? Everybody loves to say best practice. Well, if you really adopt the mindset that you've got to constantly be learning, there is no best, right?
That's right.
I mean,
Right.
it's promising. And
then with an iterative cycle of constant
That's
review and then mid-course corrections as appropriate. Yeah.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I ask this question of every guest who comes on the program, and so I'd like to ask it to you as well. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate for you?
In a word, reality. I mean, it kind of goes back to something I just said. I think, and I'm not saying this because I'm on the show, I think it's a brilliant name for this show. We are imperfect people living in an imperfect world, trying to do perfect things for kids. And you're not always going to hit that. And I think one of the things that it's been my experience over the years is we don't give teachers and administrators the room to say, you know what, I'm not that good at that. I need to get better. Carl Wyman, who's a dear friend of mine, former Nobel Prize winner in physics, after he won his Nobel, he decided he wanted to work in education. And his study, and it was focused naturally on physics education. And he kind of came up with this model of this sliding scale between novice and master. And it just has always resonated with me that we are never perfect because we are always on that spectrum. And we don't always give people the permission to slide backward on that. Because if you really get the field of education, you get the fact that I'm going to keep building, I'm going to get better, better, better. But then as soon as something changes in the system, a new set of standards, a new assessment, a new accountability system, a difference in community priorities, I'm going to slip back toward novice. And that's okay. As long as I realize that my goal is to get back, right? And I think people who think that I've got to stay here at master all the time, they're not living in a world of reality. They're living in, oh, I got this down. Well, no, that's actually when you become ineffective. I believe the most effective leaders recognize they're imperfect.
So I want to talk a minute about the Mosaic Project. It is one of our favorite organizations and has over 25 years of experience empowering students to really celebrate differences, communicate assertively, and resolve conflict peacefully at their outdoor school. I happen to have experience being part of the Mosaic Project, and so I can absolutely tell you it's an amazing organization. Their innovative SEL curriculum is now available to our Imperfect Leader audience. And so you can get a 10% discount through their new documentary film-based Mosaic Classroom Project. So just let the people know during your onboarding process to receive that 10% discount is to just mention an Imperfect Leader. Learn more about the Mosaic Project at mosaicproject.org.
When leaders think in systems, they think differently. They see the big picture, making decisions that create coherence and strengthen communication across their teams. They build adaptability, flexibility, and engagement. Every day, school leaders face complex challenges, from student engagement to staff alignment. What if your team could see those challenges as part of a bigger picture? That's what happens when you think in systems. It's how leaders turn complexity into connection and challenges into opportunities for growth. At the Waters Center for Systems Thinking, we help educators and organizations build this capacity, developing the habits and tools that turn vision into action. Think differently, think in systems. Sign up for our webinars, free resources, or a consultation by visiting our website, which you can find in the show notes.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And our guest today is Dr. Stephen Pruitt, the president of the Southern Regional Education Board. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made, and then we discuss it. So, Stephen, what happened?
So there were many to choose from. The one I think I'm going to go with is one that was less about a specific decision and more about a vast amount of learning that took place. In January of 2018, I was the Commissioner of Education in Kentucky, and we had a school shooting at Marshall County High School. As you can imagine, it's a horrible, horrible thing. And I did what I think a lot of people do. I felt like we were pretty solid. We had invested a lot of money in prevention of any of these kind of incidents. We had invested a lot of money in supporting administrators on how to manage such an incident. And I thought that we were in a pretty good place. So I went the day after, and I took a couple of my staff with me. We went to work. I didn't go with an entourage or media. I actually ducked all the media. They didn't even know I was there. And we spent the next week at the school. And what we saw in the aftermath of that was a complete misjudgment on my part of what it really took to manage a full crisis beginning to end. And the school did a fantastic job. The Kentucky State Police said they did everything they were supposed to do. But what we learned is that there were 3 phases to crisis. There's prevention, there's management, but then there's recovery.
Yeah.
And so I'm sitting in a room the day after with 4 counselors from the high school, the principal, the assistant principal, and the superintendent. And I am there mainly as support. They are going through their plans. And they asked me to be kind of the critical friend to the plan. And they had this incredible plan of how to get people back into the building and the counseling needed. And we were having horrible conversations about things that never thought about having to have. Everything from how do we get the building back ready to open, and how do you navigate students around certain areas, to how do you manage impromptu memoriams. I mean, it's just this whole thing. But they had this great plan, and there were only 4 counselors. And
how many students at the high school?
So at the high school, they had around 1,000, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So it was in no way could there be any actual triage there. And they had set up all these stations of how different kids, about whether they knew, the students who were injured, whether they knew the shooter. This was actually a situation where the shooter was actually very popular in the school. So you had a different kind of dynamic there. And I'm like, how are you going to do all this? Because not only do you not have enough people, but you also don't have, you yourself are hurting on this.
And for children, for them to feel as if they feel safe emotionally, not just physically, those 4 counselors are likely people that the kids know. So to bring in counselors for what might be considered window dressing, in the sense like, we now have 20 counselors. It will take some time. And yes, these are incredibly talented and trained individuals to build rapport quickly. It requires children to have some relationship. And then, to your point, bringing in the adults, their needs and the trauma that they're feeling and that they're carrying.
And there has to be a very specialized training, right? So even if you bring in additional counselors, you can't just say you had training being a counselor. You have to actually have, there's more to it than that. Sure. And so you kind of have this issue of stabilization and triage. And so we're having this conversation, and I said, how are you going to pull this off? And they said, honestly, we don't know. We've not planned for this. We knew this is what we wanted to do. One of the benefits to a state commissioner is I've got resources and I've got people. So I made a phone call, and we had almost 50 counselors there by the next morning. But to train them on the plan, to train them on how to do triage, to train them on how to do stabilization. And I had the person with me that was in charge of counselors that was our coordinator for counselors at the department. And what we realized was we couldn't do what a lot of schools do in this situation or natural disasters. So, just to be clear, this is not a story just about, a shooting. This is also happens after natural disasters.
It could be a hurricane, it could be a tornado, it could be fire, whatever it might be.
Bringing 500 counselors in for 3 days really doesn't do anything. So what we had to do was we spent the next year building a whole group of people throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky that were trained in how to come into a situation that they don't have those relationships, but how can they help stabilize and then refer students to where they need to be referred to. And it just opened up this whole other world for me that I've been thinking about this all wrong.
That
it can't just be about prevention, and it can't just be, and the management itself. The superintendent, I got there and he reaches in his pocket. I said, what can I do? He holds a 4-inch thick set of business cards where people just showed up to help. He said, I don't know any of these people, And so just the management part, which extends into the after, it's not really recovery, but you're still kind of managing it. There were people who showed up who were genuinely wanting to help. But, you end up with so many people, they get in each other's way. There's no coordination. But you also get people who show up who maybe don't have the best interest at heart, right?
And so schools, as a general rule, have very strict protocols on who can be on premises. And that has to be the case even after an event.
Absolutely. In fact, it's even more so after an event,
right? Because sometimes that is the absolute opportunity one takes to engage in behavior that is just counterproductive to the school. So, okay, if it's all right, because I didn't follow my own rules, which is tell me what happened, and then I got totally into it. And so let's back up for a moment and just, if it's okay, I'm going to summarize as I best understand. So the unimaginable happens. This is everyone's worst nightmare for a child, for a teacher, for staff, for parents, for superintendent, and then certainly at the state level to hear that there's been a shooting at a school. And then to know that there are those who were injured. And so if I understand correctly, the school, they had a plan in place. They followed their plan. They managed in the moment well. And now a day after, you and others who absolutely care and should are now on site to do some debriefing, but also to engage in the recovery process. In terms of recovery, how do we recover from something like this? And we've walked through a number of pieces, certainly about counselors and things like that. So typically I ask, so what got overlooked? Is that the biggest part, the counselor piece?
Not just the counselor piece. It's the whole phase of what recovery looks like.
Got it.
And, we were in a position where we weren't even really there for debriefing so much because that was somebody else's role. That was the Kentucky State Police and local police. For us, it was just, how do we help you? And it's, if you haven't lived that, you don't necessarily know how to plan for it. And so I recognize that. But when I look back at it, what I realized was that if you don't have a plan, and obviously that plan can't be so detailed because you don't know what the situation is going to be, but you've got to have enough of a framework that says, if this happens, here are 5 things I've got to do in the first 3 days before students come back to the building, right? Or before we can even begin to think about reopening.
I imagine there's a lot of pressure you want to get kids back, you want to get them back into routine, you want them to feel safe. If they are out of the building for a number of days, that only end with social media, it only increases the anxiety and stress about even being in that building. How did you balance, because I can imagine you want to be present. And I think you took this into account because you didn't bring the media, you didn't notify them. You wanted to be, I don't know, low key, but in the sense that our presence as leaders can disrupt the school setting. I know that from a superintendent's perspective, when there was a crisis, a fight or something like that. And if I show up, now your principal feels an obligation to attend to their boss to some extent, to this, title. And they're also trying to deal with parents and kids and staff and all those kinds of things. So I imagine to this next level, now you're showing up and the superintendent is maybe a little bit distracted of trying to attend to their building principal and as well as you. How do you manage that?
So the way I did it, the whole dress for success mentality.
Is this a Pruittism?
This is a little bit of a Pruittism.
Okay. I'm just trying to prepare myself.
I took my chief academic officer and my counselor coordinator, and I said, do not bring nice clothes, bring polos and jeans because we're going to work. So our first meeting with the superintendent, the principal, and the counselors was, nobody needs to know we're here. We are here to do whatever it is that will help you. The media does not know I'm here. Therefore, you have no obligation to manage me in any way, shape, or form. In fact, the first day, they had to sit out in the lobby for 2 hours while they were dealing with other stuff. And I was completely fine with that. A key part, though, as we say all the time in education, is the relationship. I had a relationship with that superintendent. So he kind of knew how I operated a little bit anyway. So we go into it with the idea that, look, not only does no one know we're here, you are all forbidden from telling anybody we're here. Okay?
Because this isn't about us.
That's right. And so we would wander in and out of things. And I mean, it's not like when you're commissioner of education, you're not in the newspaper, on television and all that. But context matters. And people don't expect folks in those positions to just be the guy in jeans and a polo standing over there to the side. I think probably one of those things I felt like we were doing it the right way was we were having to help move book bags from the school into the gym because the Kentucky State Police had to go through all the book bags.
Oh, wow.
And there were some parent and teacher volunteers that were helping with that. So we're moving the book bags, and I had one.
A superintendent is thinking to themselves right now, you go through all those book bags. Is there a protocol for, so what happens if we find weed? What happens if we find, right? Because in that moment, what are we going to do? And I'm not going to ask you
that's
what
exactly
you chose
right.
to do, but these are the things that run through my mind immediately. Okay.
And that again goes back to that whole management part, right? Of how do you plan for those kinds of things? And in my case, I've got them worried about their state test coming up in 4 months. So I was like, well, y'all aren't taking the test. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, I'm excusing all of your students from taking the state test. We're not going to worry about that. And
was that
so
something that you had vetted with your team, or this is just, it was in that moment because you're clearly a compassionate person and you're empathizing about their situation. Let me unburden you. I have this position and this title to do that. And then did anyone on your team go, are we really doing that? You're like,
well, to be careful, I did text my assessment director and say, statutorily, I have no problem doing this, correct? And she said, yes.
Okay.
And so, I did make sure I was following the law.
Yeah.
But, it was not
I
something
could see
they
myself
needed to worry
saying
about.
something like that. And then going,
Right.
is that okay?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
good that you
it was
checked
like,
ahead of time.
because the first time they were like, the people with me were like, well, can they do that? I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do it. I was already on some kind of super secret probation with the feds at that point anyway. So, I was always in some kind of argument with them. But I think the part that you're bringing up about what you find in the book bags and my issue with the assessment is in your mindset in that kind of situation, are you removing barriers to recovery or are you creating more? And so my thing was, let's take any barriers off the table. Let's take care of these kids. So, and the superintendent and the principal had the same philosophy. And it was the Kentucky State Police that were actually going to the book bags. It was not school personnel because they were going looking for one thing, additional weapons. And so that barrier got taken off the table because you didn't have to worry about, oh, well, we found a pack of weed or whatever. It was, let's focus on this. So I'm helping with that. And I had somebody say, so whose dad are you? And I said, oh, I said, I'm nobody's dad. I'm just a volunteer helping. And I heard another teacher pull that person to the side and say, that's the commissioner, and I kind of felt like we might have struck the right balance with that because they didn't recognize me for who I was. And I think that when you are a leader and you have to go into those kind of situations, you need to set those boundaries when you walk in the building. I think people who have to be taken care of can be great leaders, but I also think they can also be huge inhibitors.
Yeah.
And I think that you've got to recognize that there's something bigger and more important than you and your title. People won't automatically do that unless you give them permission to do that. So that's why in the very first time we were all together, I'm like, let's be crystal clear. We're just here to help. I mean, they sent me to go get food. They sent me, literally, we were just doing that kind of stuff. And I was good with that. And I think from a leadership standpoint, you have to give people permission to treat you as a servant in terms of servant leadership, more so than, well, I'm the superintendent.
That's right. So let me ask you this as we come to time together. In the end, what was something that was good that came out of this experience? Because through any one of our experiences, there are lessons learned. I imagine there's something around recovery that became a statewide practice. Would you talk a little bit about what was something that was good that came out of this?
So one thing that was great that came out of it is now there's an entire cadre across the whole Commonwealth of Kentucky of teachers who have been trained in a curriculum that is specific to psychological first aid and stabilization. So at the time we had two areas of the state, and they happened to be in Western Kentucky, who had gone through this type of training. Today, there are trained counselors in all districts. So well over 120 individuals have been trained and prepared should something like this happen again. There is a central place that kind of acts as a hub in case there's a situation where there needs to be additional counselors brought in. There's more awareness that the week after the event is not when the counseling or other types of recovery have to take place. That it actually is, recovery for me is what happens when the cameras leave. This is what you do up until at least the week after the anniversary of the event.
It actually seems so likely. I mean, just in terms of just how we personally grieve when we've lost someone we love. And when the food is no longer coming each day and there isn't someone sitting with you, how do you really engage in meaningful recovery, reflection? And
it's a perfect analogy. It really is. And these people who were hurting are now left to try to figure it out. I mean, I know that we at KDE, we kept coordinating counselors into Marshall County for a whole year because they needed that. And it was something that now Kentucky's prepared for. Haven't talked about this to a whole lot of people, but I will share it with you and your audience that has also stayed on my mind since January of 18. And you're going to be seeing soon an announcement that we at SREB are doing that for the entire 16-state region where we're going to be
read my mind, Stephen.
that.
I thought this would be a perfect issue for SREB Journal. How do you think about and tie not just the technical be prepared, the social, emotional, mental health piece of recovery for children? And I love the fact that you did not leave out the adults who often try to just carry the traumas of others until a point where it's such a breaking point. I've seen it as a superintendent, and we invested in EAP, and that is good and valuable, and it is often not even enough. So
absolutely true. And so we're excited. We hope we don't have to use it. But what we've seen with Hurricane Helene, and we've seen a school shooting here in Georgia in Barrow County, within the next year, there are going to be trained counselors in all 16 states that we at SREB will be working whenever there is a major significant incident for us to help deploy support to that area so that especially rural areas who don't have the additional supports. So we're excited about that. Like I said, I hope we never have to deploy, but at the same time, I feel like this is a role we can play. So excited may be the wrong way to put it.
No, it's encouraging.
Yeah.
It's to your point that you said earlier in our conversation, no great idea died in the vision phase. It sounds like you moved from vision to action, and that's really inspiring.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
My guest today was Dr. Stephen Pruitt, the president of the Southern Regional Education Board. And Stephen, I'm so grateful that you gave me some of your time today. Thank you for all your work.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for what you do. As I said earlier, I'm tired of seeing all these people put stuff on TikTok and all about making fun of the profession. We need to remember to start. Here comes another Pruittism, the last one of the day. We got to treat education in our profession more like a Hallmark movie and less like a Lifetime movie. Because, a Hallmark movie teaches you how to love them. A Lifetime movie teaches you how to kill them. So as educators, we need to start thinking about this as a Hallmark movie. Love the profession because there's no greater one on the planet.
Okay, we are back.
Nice.
There was so much good stuff in this. Definition of standards, for one, was an important one for me because lots of people they're not sure what that means when we talk about standards and curriculum and things like that. And I just thought he did a really nice definition of it's the contract between the State Department of Ed and teachers as to what your students are going to be held accountable for.
Isn't that simple? Wonderful?
Done. That's it. That's all it is.
I thought, what a case study for the leadership idea of tight and loose. Like when in the implementation of those standards, the creation of those standards and the implementation of those science standards, they've all adopted it. They don't have the same names and they don't actually, but the one through line is clear and everybody else gets to mess with it. And I just thought, oh, this is great.
I agree. And I liked his definition between a stakeholder and a shareholder. And I loved the idea of a circus tent and the idea of the stakeholder. Where does it come from? I don't know if I didn't do enough research to say, is that really where it comes from? I don't know why it wouldn't be. And so I was like, this is so cool, right?
I fully agree. God, who was
Don't be a passive stakeholder, just holding that stake and taking
the wax.
Yeah, exactly. Be a shareholder who is actively there to support change. So there were Pruittisms, though. He says he's known for them. And I think there are probably a couple that stuck out for you.
There are two. The first is education. Basically, education is harder than rocket science.
I actually say that a lot also.
I love it. I'm like, this is why the Chick-fil-A one is so sort of interesting to me. The Chick-fil-A example was such an interesting system change. It took 3 years for them to implement a phrase. 3 years. You're talking about, tell me the definition of the standards again. Say the definition of the standards again.
It's a contract between the State Department of Education and teachers as to what your students are going to be held accountable for.
How long would it take to get a school district similar to the size? Let's go with Pruitt and all districts in the state of Kentucky to agree to and implement that contract in a way that serves the students of the youth of Kentucky.
Well, I would say if you are just mandating it, good luck. He would approach it, I imagine, because of the next generation science standards, he approached it in a very collaborative way. He harvested the wisdom of so many people. And he said when he went to Texas, it was the standards were released and over 90% of the room stood up at the different times when they were asked, who was a writer, who was a lead at the state level, who was a committee member, who reviewed. They were all standing up as to demonstrate that they were part of this process. So in that case, and I'll tell you, that took as long as Chick-fil-A's simple prompt.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it is so complicated because people are complicated. We're complicated things. This is why that move to have the different people, how you participated in the process, have everybody stand up. What he does in that moment, it's masterful. It's truly masterful.
Yeah.
It is group dynamic, graduate level. And that is, he basically goes from disparate committees and connectors to we all did this together.
Yeah. Look what we did together. So he mentions the name Chang at one point. You don't really hear it unless you're listening for it. And of course, I had the conversation with him, so I heard it. He was talking about being a chemist, and he says, so if I'm just reading the Chang book, the textbook, It's because that was my father-in-law who wrote that textbook. And when we were having this conversation before we even hit record, I said, do you know, you were a chemistry teacher. Do you know Raymond Chang? And he said, the Chang chemistry textbook? If I were in my office right now, I'd just turn around and show you it. It was my favorite textbook. So then he weaves that into middle of the conversation. So if I'm reading Chang, I'm going, oh, yeah, that's very nice.
That's so good. That's so good. I'll give you my other favorite Pruittism. It's what he ends on, that we're making a Hallmark movie, not a Lifetime movie. And the idea, he says, teach how to love, not to kill.
Yep.
And that to me that's exactly the point. Teaching kids how to love, learning how to love each other, how to love the work that they're doing, how teachers to love the students that they serve, the families that they serve. It's just over and over. It's multiple fractals. I was like, oh my goodness. For how much I make fun of Hallmark movies, I was like, I'm all in on that. I'm all in.
Yeah. Well, this is what I want to say about that, in that I feel like calling it a saying diminishes how important it is, because it is a way of being. Because when he describes showing up at the school district and doing whatever it takes and not announcing that the commissioner of education for the state is there, but rather, can I move backpacks? Can I go get you lunch? I mean, servant leadership. And it is the heart work that is really hard work for so many, because their ego gets in the way. I'm here and I want to be noticed. And he's saying to his team, we're not making a scene. We're here to be present, to be observers in the sense of it's almost overseeing an election somewhere, there, not to judge. For me, it's to call it a saying is almost like it's a throwaway. And for him, his sayings are a way of being.
I think that's so interesting. I'd be interested to hear his reflection on that as a Southerner. I am so clearly.
I was really mindful too to say to him, especially when he's talking about his journal for the organization representing all of the Southern states that put it into their legislation, that they would support this work, that there's an obvious bias around the nation around certain regions and how interesting and innovative the work that they are doing. And I just thought that was important to note, not to score points, but to elevate what is often ignored by so many around the country. And that can be applied in education and then across almost all areas of our nation, why we fall to these conclusions about certain people and certain regions.
The reason why I'm interested in knowing what he thinks of that idea of it being a way of being versus a saying is, I wonder if you would ask what's the difference, in that if I say it, I live it. And I wonder if you and I'll speak for myself, I wonder if closely that's true for me, whether or not I have to understand the being of it more than just the words of it. I don't know. It's an interesting idea.
I hear you. I think I was approaching it, and certainly through my lens of words versus deeds. You hear so many promises made, and a saying could be associated as an unfulfilled or an empty promise. Like when you say during the pandemic, heroes work here, and you put these signs in front of your business, but you haven't done anything different for the people who are working there to show them that they really are heroes. No better hours, no better wages, no better precautions, no better. So words versus deeds kind of thing.
My wondering aloud is the idea that people are people. Let's start with that. So we're making massive generalizations here.
Well, it's a human-centered leadership platform. Imperfect leadership is about human-centered leadership. So
it is. I do wonder what he would say, what Stephen Pruitt would say about, is there ever a time when your words don't have action to them? And he would probably say no. Therefore, a saying is a way of being. That's how I experienced him. And he's the kind of person that if he said, Jamie, I got a job, would you do it? I'd say yes in a hot second. No problem. What do you need me to do? And even if it was, could you go pick up lunch? I would go, yep.
Yes, he was a special kind of leader. All right, Jamie, I'll see you next week.
Yeah, I'll see you next week. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm Peter Stiepelman.
And I'm Jamie Almanzan.
Please join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print-inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader